The morning sun had barely crested over London when Sarah Mitchell, a junior press officer at Buckingham Palace, noticed something unusual on her computer screen. An official palace document sat in her draft folder, one she had never seen before. The letterhead bore the royal coat of arms, and the subject line made her blood run cold. Official statement regarding the passing of His Majesty King Charles III. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the document. Every protocol was outlined in precise detail, from the immediate notification procedures to the succession arrangements. The timestamp showed it had been created just hours earlier, at 3:47 a.m. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. The king had appeared healthy during his last public engagement just 2 days prior. Without thinking clearly, Sarah screenshot the document and sent it to her colleague, James, with a frantic message asking if he knew anything about it. Within minutes, her phone was buzzing with calls from James, who was equally confused and alarmed. Neither of them realized that James, in his panic, had accidentally forwarded the image to a group chat that included several journalists he knew from his previous job at a tabloid. The leak spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Within an hour, hashtags related to the king's supposed death were trending worldwide. News outlets scrambled to verify the information, while palace officials remained unaware of the chaos brewing outside their walls. Sarah sat frozen at her desk, watching in horror as her mistake unfolded into a global crisis. Meanwhile, King Charles himself was peacefully having breakfast at his country estate, completely oblivious to the fact that millions of people around the world believed he had passed away during the night. The palace's morning briefing was still hours away, and the senior staff who would typically monitor social media were caught, completely off guard by the speed at which the false news was spreading. The morning news. Broadcasts began picking up the story, with anchors cautiously reporting on unverified claims, while social media exploded with condolences and tributes. The British pound began fluctuating wildly on international markets as traders reacted to the news. Commonwealth nations started preparing official responses, and world leaders' offices were fielding calls from confused diplomatic staff. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the first wave of reporters began gathering outside Buckingham Palace, their cameras trained on the building's facade. Tour groups scheduled for that morning found themselves swept up in the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom were placing flowers and leaving notes of sympathy. The atmosphere was somber and confused, with nobody quite sure what to believe. Sarah finally managed to call her supervisor, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. The realization that she had inadvertently triggered an international incident began to sink in. Her supervisor, initially skeptical, quickly understood the gravity of the situation when he saw the trending topics on his own phone. Emergency protocols were immediately activated, but the damage was already done. The false announcement had taken on a life of its own, spreading faster than any official correction could hope to catch up. News agencies that prided themselves on careful fact-checking found themselves caught. Between their professional standards and the pressure to report on what appeared to be breaking news of enormous significance, the story was everywhere, and yet nowhere could anyone find an official confirmation. By mid-morning, the confusion had reached fever pitch. Television networks were interrupting regular programming with special reports, while their correspondents struggled to provide updates on a story that seemed to exist only in the digital realm. The palace press office's phones were ringing constantly, but the staff were still trying to understand the scope of the crisis they were facing. King Charles, still enjoying his quiet morning routine, remained the only person in the United Kingdom who hadn't heard about his own reported demise. His security detail had received some unusual communication requests, but nothing that seemed urgent enough to disturb the monarch's breakfast. The bubble of normalcy around the king stood in stark contrast to the chaos erupting across the globe in response to news of his supposed death. The national implications were becoming more serious by the hour. Stock markets were reacting to the uncertainty. Diplomatic protocols were being activated, and millions of people were experiencing genuine grief for a monarch they believed had passed away. What had started as a simple clerical error was rapidly becoming one of the most significant false news.
Yes,
Events in modern royal history as the morning progressed. The pressure on palace officials to respond was mounting exponentially. Every minute of silence was being interpreted as either confirmation or careful preparation of an official statement. The traditional measured pace of royal communications was completely inadequate for the speed at which this crisis was developing in the digital age. Sarah sat at her desk, watching the consequences of her actions unfold in real time across every news channel and social media platform. The document that had caused all this chaos was still on her screen, looking official and ominous. She couldn't understand how such a detailed and formal-looking announcement had appeared in the palace's systems, or why it had been accessible to someone at her level. Questions about security protocols and document management were already forming in her mind. But those concerns seemed minor compared to the immediate crisis at hand. The palace's senior communications team finally assembled for what would become the most urgent crisis meeting in recent royal history. Lord Chamberlain William Hartwell rushed through the corridors, his usual composed demeanor replaced by visible concern. The morning briefing room, typically used for routine scheduling discussions, had been transformed into a war room with laptops displaying various news channels and social media feeds. Communications. Director Margaret Thompson spread printouts of news articles across the mahogany table, each headline more dramatic than the last. Major international networks were now carrying the story as their lead item, while palace phone lines were completely overwhelmed with calls from journalists, government officials, and concerned citizens. The situation had escalated far beyond anything their standard crisis protocols had anticipated. Meanwhile, at his country residence, King Charles finally learned of his reported death when his private secretary, David Pemberton, burst into the study with unprecedented urgency. The king's initial reaction was one of bewilderment, followed by dry amusement as he processed the absurdity of the situation. However, his demeanor quickly became serious when David explained the global scale of the confusion and its potential implications for the monarchy's stability. The king immediately understood that this was not merely an embarrassing mistake, but a crisis that could undermine public trust in royal institutions. Financial markets were already reacting negatively, the pound dropping against major currencies as investors grappled with uncertainty about Britain's constitutional future. Commonwealth nations were implementing contingency plans, and some had already begun drafting official statements of condolence. Back at Buckingham Palace, the security team was conducting an urgent investigation into how the false document had entered their systems. Chief Security Officer Robert Hayes discovered that the document bore all the hallmarks of authentic palace communications, including proper formatting, official language, and accurate procedural details. This suggested either an elaborate hoax by someone with inside knowledge or a serious security breach within their own systems. The investigation revealed that the document had been created using legitimate palace templates and contained information that would only be known to senior staff members involved in succession planning. This discovery sent shockwaves through the security team as it implied that either their systems had been compromised by sophisticated hackers or someone within the palace walls was responsible for the leak. Television networks were struggling with the unprecedented challenge of reporting on a story that seemed to exist in a verification vacuum. BBC News had assembled their top royal correspondents, but they found themselves in the unusual position of being unable to confirm or deny reports about the monarchy's most significant potential event. Their measured approach contrasted sharply with social media, where speculation and misinformation were spreading unchecked. International news agencies were facing similar challenges as they tried to balance journalistic responsibility with the pressure to report on what appeared to be breaking news of global significance. CNN, France 24, and Deutsche, all found themselves broadcasting carefully worded reports about unconfirmed claims, while their teams worked frantically to reach palace officials for verification. The false news had triggered a cascade of real-world consequences that were becoming increasingly difficult to reverse. The London Stock Exchange was experiencing unusual trading patterns as investors reacted to constitutional uncertainty. Travel agencies reported a surge in cancellations for London tours, while florists near royal residences were running out of flowers as people arrived to pay their respects. Social media platforms were struggling to control the spread of misinformation while balancing free speech concerns with the need to prevent panic. Twitter and Facebook had begun adding warning labels to posts about the king's death, but the sheer volume of content made effective moderation nearly impossible. Conspiracy theories were already emerging, with some users claiming the leaked document was evidence of a cover-up. The royal family's other members were being notified of the crisis as they went about their morning activities. Prince William, who was attending a charity event in Wales, was pulled aside by his protection officer and briefed on the situation. His immediate concern was for his father's well-being and the potential impact on his young children, who might hear about their grandfather's supposed death through school friends or social media. Palace. Staff members were experiencing varying levels of panic and confusion as they tried to understand how their workplace had become the center of an international incident. Long-serving employees, who had weathered previous royal crises, found themselves in uncharted territory, dealing with the unique challenges of digital-age misinformation spreading faster than any traditional response Hennessim could address. The pressure on the palace to issue an official statement was becoming overwhelming, but communications staff knew that a hastily prepared response could potentially make the situation worse. They needed to craft a message that would definitively end the speculation while also addressing the serious questions about how such a detailed false document had originated from within their own systems. Prime Minister's office was monitoring the situation closely, recognizing that constitutional confusion could have serious political and economic implications. Government communications specialists were offering assistance to the palace, while Treasury officials were tracking the market reactions and preparing contingency measures if the financial instability continued to escalate. As the morning progressed, the human cost of the false announcement was becoming apparent. Elderly royal supporters who had heard the news were experiencing genuine distress, with some being taken to hospitals after emotional reactions to what they believed was the death of their beloved monarch. Care homes across the Commonwealth were dealing with confused and upset residents who couldn't understand why there was no official ceremony or formal announcement. The midday sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as the crisis reached its most critical phase. Communications Director Margaret Thompson made the unprecedented decision to prepare a live video statement featuring King Charles himself, the only definitive way to prove he was alive and well. However, this solution created new challenges. As the king was still at his country estate, more than 2 hours away from London, security protocols required careful coordination for any unscheduled royal movement, especially given the current chaos surrounding the palace. The king's protection team worked frantically to arrange a secure route back to London while maintaining the confidentiality necessary to prevent media. Helicopters from tracking the royal convoy. Every decision had to balance urgency with security, as the situation had attracted global attention and potentially hostile interest. Meanwhile, international diplomatic channels were buzzing with confusion and concern. The Canadian Prime Minister's office had prepared a formal statement of condolence, while Australian officials were drafting constitutional procedures for acknowledging the new monarch. Embassy staff in various countries found themselves fielding calls from confused expatriates seeking clarification about the status of their head of state. Investigation into the documents. Origin had uncovered disturbing details that suggested a sophisticated operation rather than a simple mistake. Forensic specialists discovered that the false announcement had been created using administrative credentials that belonged to a senior staff member who was currently on vacation in Scotland. This revelation pointed to either identity theft or an inside job, adding a criminal dimension to what had initially appeared to be an unfortunate error. Sarah Mitchell, the unwitting catalyst of the crisis, was now being questioned by palace security officers in a small conference room. Her account of finding the mysterious document in her draft folder raised more questions than it answered. Security cameras showed no unusual access to her workstation, and her computer logs indicated normal usage patterns. The mystery of how the document had appeared in her system remained unsolved, television news operations were adapting their coverage as the story evolved throughout the day. Royal correspondents who had spent years building relationships with palace sources found themselves as confused as their viewers. The usual reliable channels of information had gone silent, creating an information vacuum that was being filled with speculation and analysis rather than facts. The economic impact was becoming more pronounced as international markets continued to react to the uncertainty. Currency traders were making decisions based on constitutional implications they didn't fully understand, while tourism industry representatives were calculating potential losses from canceled bookings and postponed events. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate confusion about the king's status. King Charles, now traveling back to London in a secure convoy, was using the journey time to work with his private secretary on the precise wording of his upcoming statement. The challenge was to address not only his continued existence, but also the serious questions about palace security and information management that the incident had raised. His statement would need to restore confidence while acknowledging the legitimate concerns the leak had created. Social media companies were implementing increasingly aggressive measures to control the spread of false information, but their efforts were hampered by the initial lack of official contradiction. The vacuum of authoritative information had allowed conspiracy theories to flourish, with some users now claiming that any official denial would itself be part of a cover-up. The platforms found themselves in the impossible position of fact-checking claims about events that hadn't happened. Palace staff were dealing with unprecedented media attention as reporters and camera crews surrounded all known royal residences. The normal security perimeter had been expanded, but journalists with telephoto lenses were still attempting to capture any evidence of activity that might confirm or deny the reports. The siege-like atmosphere was unlike anything experienced during previous royal crises. Inside the palace, crisis management teams were coordinating with government communications specialists to ensure their response aligned with broader constitutional and political considerations. The incident had exposed vulnerabilities in both palace security systems and the broader information ecosystem that protected the monarchy from false claims and malicious attacks. The false announcement had also triggered automatic procedures in several Commonwealth nations, where constitutional protocols required immediate action upon the death of the monarch. Officials in these countries now faced the embarrassing task of reversing measures they had begun implementing, while also questioning why they had not received official notification through proper diplomatic channels. Religious leaders across the Commonwealth had begun preparing special services and statements, only to find themselves in an awkward position as doubt crept in about the veracity of the reports. The Archbishop of Canterbury's office was coordinating with palace officials to understand the situation while preparing for various scenarios, including the possibility that official duties might be required if the reports proved true. The King's convoy was now approaching London's outskirts, with security teams coordinating the final approach to ensure safe passage through the increased media presence around the capital. Advanced units were reporting unprecedented numbers of journalists and camera crews positioned along likely routes to the palace, creating logistical challenges for the security operation. Emergency procedures at major hospitals had been quietly activated in preparation for potential public order issues related to the constitutional crisis. Mental health services were reporting increased calls from people struggling to cope with the uncertainty, particularly elderly citizens who had strong emotional connections to the monarchy and were finding the conflicting information deeply distressing. The afternoon shift change at the palace brought fresh staff members who were briefed on the ongoing crisis, but many found it difficult to comprehend how a single leaked document had created such widespread chaos. The normal rhythm of palace life had been completely disrupted, with all routine activities suspended in favor of crisis management and damage control. The afternoon brought a new level of intensity to the crisis as king. Charles arrived back at Buckingham Palace through a carefully orchestrated security operation. His convoy had successfully avoided the media gauntlets, but palace officials knew that the real challenge lay ahead in crafting a response that would restore public confidence, while addressing the serious security breach that had enabled the false announcement. Television studios across the globe were now broadcasting continuous coverage of what had become the most significant royal communications crisis in modern history. Expert commentators struggled to provide analysis of a situation that had no precedent, while royal historians were being consulted to understand the constitutional implications of such widespread confusion about the monarch's status. The king's first priority upon arriving was to record a brief video message that would be distributed immediately to prove he was alive and well. However, palace communications teams insisted on additional security measures, including verification procedures that would prevent any future claims that the video itself might be falsified. The recording session required multiple camera angles and witnesses to ensure authenticity. Meanwhile, the investigation into the document's origin had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated cyber attack that appeared to target the palace's internal communication systems. Computer forensics experts discovered traces of malware designed to access and modify official documents, suggesting that the false announcement was part of a deliberate attempt to destabilize the monarchy rather than a simple mistake or prank. The security breach had implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, raising questions about the protection of sensitive royal information and the potential for future attacks. Intelligence services were now involved in the investigation, treating the incident as a potential threat to national security rather than merely an embarrassing communications failure. International news networks were preparing to broadcast the king's video message live, but technical teams were implementing unusual verification procedures to ensure the authenticity of the feed. The extraordinary circumstances required unprecedented security measures, as officials recognized that any doubt about the video's legitimacy could perpetuate rather than resolve the crisis. Financial markets showed signs of stabilizing, as word spread that an official royal statement was imminent, but traders remained cautious about the broader implications of the security breach. Currency analysts were expressing concern about the vulnerability of British institutions to digital attacks, while tourism industry representatives were calculating the long-term damage to London's reputation as a stable destination. Palace staff members were experiencing a range of emotions as the day's events unfolded, from relief that the king was safe to anxiety about the long-term consequences for their workplace security. Many employees were questioning whether their communications systems could be trusted, while senior officials were already planning comprehensive security reviews and system upgrades. The human impact of the false announcement was becoming more apparent as the afternoon progressed. Emergency services reported increased calls from elderly citizens experiencing anxiety attacks related to the constitutional confusion, while counseling services were providing support to people who had been genuinely grieving for a monarch they believed had died. Social media platforms were now actively suppressing posts related to the king's supposed death, but the damage to public trust in information sources had already been done. The incident highlighted the challenges facing democratic societies in distinguishing between legitimate news and sophisticated misinformation, particularly when false information originated from seemingly authoritative sources. The king himself was working with constitutional experts and senior advisors to ensure his upcoming statement addressed not only the immediate crisis, but also the broader questions about royal security and communication protocols. His message would need to balance reassurance with acknowledgement of the serious vulnerabilities the incident had exposed. Government officials were coordinating with palace communications teams to ensure the royal response aligned with national security interests, while also preparing their own statements about the investigation into the cyber attack. The incident had implications for cybersecurity policies across government institutions, as the attack methods could potentially be used against other critical infrastructure. Commonwealth nations were preparing to issue coordinated statements once the king's video message was released. But diplomatic officials were also reviewing their own security protocols for receiving and verifying official communications from the British monarch. The incident had exposed weaknesses in international communication systems. That could have far-reaching consequences. The afternoon media coverage was becoming increasingly focused on the security implications rather than the immediate question of the king's well-being. As journalists and analysts began to understand the sophisticated nature of the attack that had created the false announcement, cybersecurity experts were being consulted to explain how such an operation might have been conducted and who might have been responsible. Religious and community leaders who had initially prepared statements of condolence were now dealing with confused congregations and community members seeking guidance about how to interpret the day's events. The psychological impact of experiencing collective grief for an event that hadn't occurred was creating unique pastoral challenges that required careful handling. As the afternoon wore on, the palace communications team was making final preparations for the king's video statement, while also coordinating with law enforcement agencies investigating the cyber attack. The response would need to address multiple audiences, from confused citizens to international partners, while maintaining the dignity and authority expected of royal communications. The king's video recording session was conducted under unprecedented security measures, with multiple authentication procedures designed to prevent any future claims of manipulation or falsification. Technical experts ensured that the broadcast would include verifiable metadata and multiple confirmation sources to establish its authenticity beyond any reasonable doubt. The evening hours brought the most dramatic resolution to the crisis, as King Charles appeared live on television screens around the world, his calm and composed presence immediately dispelling the day's confusion. His carefully crafted statement acknowledged the serious security breach while reassuring the public of his continued good health and commitment to his royal duties. The relief was palpable as millions of viewers witnessed undeniable proof that their monarch was very much alive. The king's address was broadcast simultaneously across all major networks, with unprecedented coordination between British and international media outlets to ensure maximum reach and credibility. His statement was brief but comprehensive, addressing the false announcement, expressing regret for the confusion caused, and outlining immediate steps being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Financial markets responded immediately to the king's appearance, with the British pound recovering much of its earlier losses within minutes of the broadcast beginning. Trading floors that had spent the day managing uncertainty and speculation suddenly experienced a wave of relief buying as investors realized the constitutional crisis they had feared was not materializing. The rapid market recovery demonstrated the extent to which the false announcement had affected international confidence. Social media platforms experienced an immediate shift in content as users shared relief, gratitude, and in many cases, embarrassment about their earlier reactions to the false news. The hashtags that had dominated trending topics throughout the day were quickly replaced by messages of support for the king and criticism of the security failures that had enabled the crisis. Palace communications teams were simultaneously managing the positive response to the king's statement while continuing to coordinate with law enforcement and intelligence agencies investigating the cyber attack. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the broader security implications required ongoing attention and careful public communication to maintain confidence in royal institutions. The investigation had now identified the attack as originating from a sophisticated cybercriminal organization with possible state-level support, though the specific perpetrators remained unknown. Technical analysis revealed that the malware used to access palace systems had been specifically designed to target royal communications infrastructure, suggesting months of preparation and detailed knowledge of internal procedures. International diplomatic channels that had been disrupted throughout the day were quickly restored as ambassadors, and government officials received official confirmation of the king's well-being. The coordination required to correct the false information across dozens of countries highlighted the global reach of the British monarchy and the potential for communications failures to create widespread diplomatic confusion. News organizations that had spent the day carefully navigating the unverified. Claims were now conducting internal reviews of their coverage, examining how they had handled the unprecedented challenge of reporting on false information that appeared to originate from authoritative sources. The incident would likely influence journalism standards and verification procedures for years to come. The human cost of the day's events was becoming clearer as evening approached, with healthcare services reporting that hundreds of people had sought medical attention for stress-related symptoms caused by the false announcement. Elderly citizens who had strong emotional connections to the monarchy were particularly affected, with many expressing feelings of betrayal and confusion about how they had been misled. Sarah Mitchell, the palace staff member who had unwittingly triggered the crisis, was finally released from questioning after investigators confirmed her innocence in the cyber attack. However, she faced an uncertain future at the palace, as the incident had highlighted vulnerabilities in staff access to sensitive information that would require comprehensive review and likely restructuring. The king's evening schedule included private meetings with senior security officials and government representatives to discuss the long-term implications of the attack and necessary improvements to royal communications security. These conversations would shape future protocols for managing royal information and protecting against similar cyber threats. Religious leaders across the Commonwealth were addressing their congregations about the day's events, using the incident as an opportunity to discuss the importance of verifying information and the dangers of spreading unconfirmed reports. The false announcement had created unexpected teachable moments about media literacy and the responsibility of individuals in sharing information. Law enforcement agencies were coordinating an international investigation into the cyber attack, recognizing that the sophistication of the operation suggested involvement by organized criminal groups or state actors with significant technical capabilities. The investigation would likely continue for months and could reveal broader threats to critical infrastructure beyond the royal communication systems. Evening news broadcasts were providing comprehensive analysis of the day's events, with experts examining both the immediate crisis management response and the broader implications for cybersecurity and information warfare. The incident was being compared to other recent examples of sophisticated misinformation campaigns that had targeted democratic institutions. Palace staff were beginning the process of returning to normal operations while implementing enhanced security measures that would change their daily routines permanently. The incident had demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most protected institutions to digital attacks, requiring fundamental changes to how sensitive information was managed and protected. The king's public appearance had successfully resolved the immediate crisis, but the deeper questions raised by the security breach would require sustained attention from cybersecurity experts, government officials, and royal communications professionals. The day's events had highlighted the evolving nature of threats facing traditional institutions in an increasingly connected world. As evening deepened, the immediate panic and confusion of the morning seemed almost surreal to those who had experienced it. However, the lessons learned from the crisis would have lasting implications for how royal communications were managed and how democratic societies protected themselves against sophisticated misinformation campaigns designed to undermine institutional stability. The late evening hours brought a sense of exhausted relief to Buckingham Palace as staff members began processing the extraordinary events that had transformed an ordinary Tuesday into one of the most challenging days in recent royal history. The king's successful video appearance had resolved the immediate crisis, but the aftermath revealed the profound impact that a single false document had created across multiple continents and countless lives. Communications Director Margaret Thompson led a comprehensive debrief session with her team, analyzing every aspect of the crisis response to identify lessons that would inform future emergency protocols. The speed at which misinformation had spread through social media and traditional news outlets had exceeded all previous expectations, demonstrating the need for new approaches to crisis management in the digital age. The international response to the king's statement was overwhelmingly positive, with world leaders expressing relief and support while also acknowledging the serious security concerns the incident had raised. European Union officials were discussing the need for enhanced cybersecurity cooperation to protect democratic institutions from similar attacks, while Commonwealth nations were reviewing their own communication protocols with British royal authorities. Financial markets had largely stabilized by the end of trading, but economic analysts were examining the broader implications of the day's volatility. The incident had demonstrated how quickly false information could affect international markets, leading to discussions about improved verification systems for news that might impact global financial stability. The cyber attack investigation was expanding as forensic analysis revealed additional details about the sophistication and scope of the operation. Intelligence agencies were now treating the incident as part of a broader pattern of attacks against democratic institutions, with preliminary evidence suggesting connections to similar operations targeting other European monarchies and government systems. Palace security officials were implementing immediate changes to information management systems while planning more comprehensive upgrades that would take months to complete. The incident had exposed vulnerabilities that required both technological solutions and fundamental changes to how sensitive royal information was accessed, stored, and distributed within the organization. Evening news programs were providing detailed postmortems of the day's events, with royal correspondents reflecting on how traditional journalism had struggled to adapt to the pace of social media-driven news cycles. The incident would likely become a case study in journalism schools and crisis communication courses for years to come, highlighting the challenges of maintaining accuracy while responding to rapidly evolving situations. Sarah Mitchell returned home that evening facing an uncertain future. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing in the creation of the false document, the incident had inadvertently made her the face of a security failure that would require extensive internal restructuring, and she knew her role at the palace would never be the same regardless of the investigation's final conclusions. The human cost of the crisis was still being calculated as healthcare services compiled reports on stress-related incidents caused by the false announcement. Support groups for elderly citizens were organizing special sessions to help people process the emotional trauma of believing they had lost their beloved monarch, while mental health professionals were studying the psychological effects of experiencing collective grief for an event that hadn't occurred. Religious communities across the Commonwealth were reflecting on the day's events during evening services, with many clergy using the incident to discuss the importance of seeking truth and the dangers of accepting information without proper verification. The false announcement had created unexpected opportunities for meaningful conversations about faith, uncertainty, and the role of institutions in providing stability during confusing times. International diplomatic relationships that had been strained by the day's confusion were being carefully repaired through a series of coordinated communications between British embassies and foreign ministries. The incident had highlighted the complex web of relationships and protocols that surrounded the British monarchy's role as head of state for multiple nations. Law enforcement agencies were coordinating with international partners to trace the origins of the cyber attack, recognizing that the perpetrators had likely operated across multiple jurisdictions using sophisticated techniques to obscure their identity and location. The investigation would require unprecedented cooperation between cybersecurity agencies in different countries. Palace staff were beginning to understand that their workplace had fundamentally changed as a result of the day's events. The security measures being implemented would affect everything from their daily routines to their communication with family members, as the organization adapted to the reality of operating in an environment where sophisticated cyber threats were an ongoing concern. The king himself spent the late evening hours in private consultation with constitutional experts and senior advisors, discussing the long-term implications of the security breach and the necessary changes to royal protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. His calm public demeanor had successfully managed the immediate crisis. But he understood that the deeper issues raised by the attack would require sustained attention and significant resources to address. As midnight approached, the palace began returning to something resembling normal operations, though with enhanced security measures that would become permanent fixtures of royal life. The day that had begun with a simple mistake by a junior staff member had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how democratic institutions could protect themselves against increasingly sophisticated threats to their credibility and stability. The false announcement of King Charles' death would be remembered not only as a dramatic crisis successfully resolved, but as a turning point that forced traditional institutions to confront the realities of information warfare in the digital age. The lessons learned from this extraordinary day of turmoil would influence royal protocols, cybersecurity policies, and media practices for generations to come, serving as a stark reminder of how quickly false information could threaten the foundations of established democratic systems.